And after the meetings, a man came up to me and he was upset because I had said that Andrew Jackson had warred against the central bank in the 1820s and 30s. He said Andrew Jackson was part of the relocation of the Indian populations from the southeast out to the Midwest and to the south as well. I said, sir, make no mistake, Andrew Jackson was far from perfect. When we comment about various individuals, be it Lincoln, Jackson, and this morning looking at JFK and his war with the Federal Reserve, we're not looking at this and saying that JFK was somehow a perfect man. Far from it. Far from it. But we are looking at some of the good things that John F. Kennedy did. But again, the only one ever that we should seek to emulate and follow in the footsteps of is Jesus Christ. So, having said that, the Golden Rule, Part 5, Kennedy and the Federal Reserve. Before we get to it, Paul, you've got a comment, please.
Your opening prayer, something you said, don't mean to interrupt, but...
no, please.
Paul says that Jesus, I believe it's in Hebrews 5:8,
yeah,
learned obedience, but that's another one of those texts that is never completely finished. I mean, it's a given if you know it. However, through his suffering, which translates to his experience, what kind of an experience did Jesus have, and what kind do we have? I mean, he had a pretty rough life, but we want it simple and easy. So what does that infer? If he's our example, we're going to have a rough life to learn obedience to God's commandments. So, and another quick comment, Andrew Jackson and JFK were pretty honorable men, no matter how you slice it. They weren't perfect, but they were very honorable men.
Paul, absolutely. Absolutely. They both stood for something. Again, they were not perfect. I know a lot of people nowadays seek to just destroy JFK because of his womanizing and other policies that he passed. Iron Mountain and global government, immigration. There were things that JFK did that we would oppose today. However, we're going to look this morning at some things that JFK did do that brought about the anger and the hatred of the papacy ultimately, but people in his cabinet, people in his very White House, because Lyndon Johnson was furious because Kennedy was considering leaving Johnson off the Democratic ticket in 1964. So there were a lot of people that did not like JFK, but ultimately it was Rome. Because Rome had a plan, and they would accomplish that plan through the United States, as we have read consistently throughout this study in Revelation chapter 13. Again, folk, not a history lesson. This is an ongoing study of how Rome and the Jesuits have wanted to gain control of the financial fabric of the United States of America. Folk, come on. We are in, what, 30 to 35 trillion dollars in debt? I mean, that is just absolute nuts. It's craziness. Well, where does that stem from? Well, it stems from the Federal Reserve. That's where it stems from, folk, because of all the money that the United States has borrowed from the Federal Reserve Bank, and now we as taxpayers are paying back the interest plus whatever principal can be applied to that astronomical figure. So that's where it all stems from, folk. It stems back to Rome's plan in the very beginning, as we saw with Robert Morris, back before Lexington and Concord. The plan was already put in. We're going to fashion an American banking system just like that which was in England, which was controlled by the Rothschilds, which the Jewish Encyclopedia says that they were working in cahoots with and on behalf of the Black Papacy. And of course, the Black Papacy are the Jesuits. So, that's where this all came from, friends. And where is it going? Well, where is it going? What is going to be the ultimate end game of this astronomical debt that America is facing? Well, Revelation chapter 13, as we've read before, starting with verse 16, he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. And that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. So the ultimate end game of Rome, through the United States, through a central bank, is to be able to force America and then ultimately the world. Because, friend, you can look at any nation on the face of this earth. In fact, I've just been reading recently from the book called The Creature from Jekyll Island, written by G. Edward Griffin. G. Edward Griffin shows conclusively that it was American financiers around 1910, 1915, 1920, people like Jacob Schiff, John D. Rockefeller, Averell Harriman, Andrew Carnegie. These men, friends, J.P. Morgan, they financed the Russian Revolution right there in 1917, 1918. You say, wait a minute. How could Americans finance the raising up of a communist dictatorship through Vladimir Ulyanov, who we know as Nikolai Lenin, and then with his passing in the early 1920s, that then was passed over to the murderer, Joseph Stalin? How could Americans do that? Well, friends, because they're not working for America. They're not working for America. When we hear the Federal Reserve talking about solving the debt problem, that is absolute nonsense, because they're not interested in halting the inflation and the insane debt that America has. They're not interested in stopping that. They're the ones that created it, friends. So why did these financiers living in America finance the Bolshevik Revolution, which has led to communism? Because they wanted to set up a central bank in Russia. Friends, there are central banks throughout the world, every country. We were in Kenya several years, 25 years ago, And I asked somebody there, I said, if you need to get money, where do you go? They said, well, we go to Barclays Bank. Barclays Bank in Kenya? Yeah. Do you know who Barclays Bank is connected to? It's connected to the Bank of England. And who controls the Bank of England? Well, they've controlled it for the last 2 centuries, friends. The Rothschild family. And ultimately, the papacy, the black papacy. So, friends, we see clearly the ultimate endgame of Rome through the financial fabric of America is to be able to force people that no man can buy or sell except he that has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. That's where this is all going, friends. It's where it's all going. And the easiest way to bring that about would be through making everything electronic, dealing only with digital currency. It's very simple to control somebody's buying and selling if with the push of a button they can cancel your deposits. That's very simple, friends. And that's where banking has come to today through the element of the central bank. Cody?
And I also want to point out, too, because a lot of folks will think that digital currency is a part of prophecy. And one thing that we also need to keep in mind that we almost had a Sunday law back in the 1880s, long before that. So it's not necessary for that to happen, but that's what it looks like it's going to be. But I think a lot of people begin to focus on the digital currency thing too much, where they don't realize that it could happen in a number of ways. That what we know from the prophecies is that it's going to happen. Not necessarily exactly how, but I do think that it will be through digital currency as well. But one thing I wanted to point out is something quite interesting. When you study the history of the bankers, especially right through ancient times, up into, right around a couple hundred years before the Reformation, you see 2 elements come into play. You see the Jews, because the Jews were bankers when they were dispersed throughout all the different countries.
Absolutely.
And it was a way of protecting themselves, because as they became bankers in these other countries, it was less likely that the leadership would kill them off if they needed them. So they became university professors and bankers primarily, and tradesmen. Mm-hmm. So what you see is the Jews, and this kind of goes into like where the Jewish conspiracy comes from. Sure. And then also, when you see the first Christian, quote-unquote, Christian bankers, they're the Templars. So it's quite interesting. You have Rome and the Jews seen in ancient history. And then when you looked at the Rothschild family, as you did very early on in the series, you saw both of those elements combined together.
Meshed together.
So it really, the trail really leads back to Rome in the end, and we need to keep that in mind.
Cody, that's a great point. Great point on all corners of that, because, like you said, back in the 1880s, they didn't have computer. They didn't have digital currency. 120, 140 years later, well, now that's in place. And how they would have done it back then, well, that's speculation, Somehow, as you look at that time period when there was a Sunday law that was introduced by Blair in the Congress back in the 1880s, late 1880s, Jacob Schiff had already been in America for 30 years. Big businesses were dominating the landscape, but again, there was no digital currency and no way for there to be a digital currency. It's a great point you're making. It's a great point. 150, 140 years later, in light of Revelation 13, in light of what we're seeing and the abilities that are in existence today, it's pretty obvious that that's what's going, that will be the mechanism that is now in place to force people's hand where they can't buy or sell. So, great point. Paul, please.
To further expound upon what you're saying about these banks, one of the major banks that came out of the early 1900s was the Bank of America, which initially was the Bank of Italy. And it pretty much got, and this blows my mind, how a sharecrop farmer of grapes in California financed the Golden Gate Bridge because they were going broke and nobody wanted to touch it. And then all of a sudden this guy came forward, and it turns out, well, he had the banking of the Bank of Italy, which became the Bank of America, which financed the Golden Gate Bridge and got amazing traction from there. And he was Italian himself, this guy. How did that happen? Doesn't anybody ask these questions? No.
That's the tragedy of it, Paul. We're so dumbed down. We don't ask questions anymore.
No.
We don't protest. We don't say, what about this? What about that? It's just, well, I accept whatever I'm told.
Unless it's the truth.
Unless it's the truth. Absolutely. Well, Kennedy and the Federal Reserve. One thing in common throughout U.S. history leading down to what we see today in the light of Revelation chapter 13. We had the War of 1812. People died because they said no more central bank in 1811, 1810. Of course, Andrew Jackson warred against the central bank. Attempts were made on his life in 1835. Abraham Lincoln stood in the way of the money lenders during the Civil War as they wanted to completely annihilate the Union and break up America into two weak factions. Lincoln stood in their way. One of the reasons why, he was killed in 1865. Then, of course, we saw that very, very wealthy men on the Titanic went down when it went down in 1912 because they were in opposition to the Federal Reserve Bank that was enacted into law some 20 months later in 1913. So all these people, all these events had to do with the money flow. And as all these people sought to oppose the central bank, they paid with it with their life. John F. Kennedy, would anybody try again to stop the central bank? Well, Revelation 13 said that there would come a time in American history when the banking system would be used to demand worship. Demand worship. Revelation 13, 15 to 17. The Federal Reserve Bank, the Jesuits, and the Rothschilds had many wars planned along with other terror attacks and pandemics. Now, folk, and I've made this clear so many times, but we're going to do it again. There's a lot of folk out there today that want to say, well, there's no such thing as a conspiracy. Folk, the conspiracy is so big and it involves so many different entities. To not believe in a conspiracy, you've got your head in the sand. It's that simple. You know, just briefly before we read this statement, Revelation chapter 17 tells us down at the time of the loud cry in Revelation 18 and verse 1 that there would be a monstrous conspiracy. Now, in Webster's dictionary, it says that a conspiracy is two or more groups or individuals united together for an evil purpose. Well, let's notice Revelation chapter 17 and 18. Let's see if we have two or more entities united together with an evil purpose to gain control of this planet. Revelation 17, verse 1 tells us, "There came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters." Well, we have an entity there, don't we? And who is this entity, the great whore of Revelation chapter 17? Who is that identifying? All the Protestant reformers and Ellen White, all were crystal clear. They didn't agree on much else. But Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Tyndale, Cranmer, Menno Simons, and it goes on and on and on. They all believed that the great whore of Revelation 17 was the papal power. So we have one entity. To get a conspiracy, we need to have at least two. Well, Revelation 17 and verse 2 tells us, "With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication." Well, who are the kings of the earth? Well, the kings of the earth would represent the political powers of earth, the presidents, the dictators, the prime ministers, people in the political realm, those who are the kings of the earth. Do we have a conspiracy? We have a conspiracy, friends. We have two groups right there, the papacy and the political powers of earth. Well, let's go to Revelation 17 and verse 5. "Upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth." Well, who are those harlot daughters that follow in the footsteps of Babylon the Great, the mother? Who are those harlot daughters? Well, those harlot daughters, friends, represent those churches that have followed in the traditions and unbiblical teachings of the papacy. And that would identify the apostate Protestant churches that are following the Sunday tradition, all kinds of false doctrines, whether it be the eternally burning hell, and it goes on and on and on and on. Do we have a conspiracy? It just keeps getting bigger, doesn't it? We have the papacy, we have the kings of the earth, we have the churches of the earth. Revelation 18, who else is involved in this conspiracy? Revelation 18:15, the Bible says, "The merchants of these things which were made rich by her." Well, who is her? Well, her is Babylon the Great. So the merchants are made rich by their connection with Babylon the Great. And what are the merchants involved in? Well, verses 12 through 14 says that they buy and sell gold and silver and stones and pearls and linen and purple and silk, cinnamon and odors and ointments and oil, flour, wheat, beasts, sheep, horses, chariots, slaves, and souls of men. Well, the merchants, friend, represent the businessmen of the earth that have sold their soul in order to receive wealth and power from the papacy. Who would be some of those merchants? Well, we have the Morgan family. We have the Chase family. We have the Rockefellers. We have the Carnegies. We have the Mellons. We have the Harrimans, the Vanderbilts, the Drexels. The great money people of the earth, friends. Bill Gates. The great money people of the world have united their interests with the Vatican. So now, friends, we don't have just two to make a conspiracy. We have four. The papacy, the political powers of earth, the churches of the earth, the businessmen of the earth. Think back for a minute during COVID, back 3 years ago. From what direction did we hear the voices that told us to surrender freedom, to follow the medical advice of the powers that be, whether it be the WHO or the CDC? Where did all that come from? Well, it came from the political powers of the earth, it came from the churches of the earth, and it came from the merchants of the earth. Folk, we have a conspiracy, and it's so monstrous, but people are so afraid to identify this monster conspiracy because probably most organizations, in fact, those that people that are afraid to identify it, they're afraid because their organization is a part of it. Make no mistake. Cody, comment?
I just wanted to say real quickly, one of the things Martin Luther had said about some of the other reformers is that it's okay to focus on the corruptions going on in the church and stuff like that. But one of the most important things that you have to do is to oppose the church doctrinally and to prove that she's in error doctrinally. And that's what you've just been showing here. So the term conspiracy theorist is actually a false term because the Bible really proposes a conspiracy fact. If you're anything, you're a conspiracy analyst, not a conspiracy theorist.
The two don't go together, Cody. It's kind of like the concept of Christian rock music.
Right.
Yeah, it's an oxymoron. And a conspiracy theorist, it's an oxymoron. They do not go together because conspiracy is on such a scale today. It's insane. It's just insane. And when I listen to people, I remember back in the mid-90s, Mark Finley, when it came to the burning of Waco, Mark Finley came out and he said, "Oh, there's no such thing as a conspiracy." And I'm going, are you trying to protect somebody? What is your point? Because the conspiracy is so big. And Revelation 17 and 18 are so clear. To carry out all the things that Rome had planned for the 20th century, World Wars I and II, Vietnam, Korea, the war in the Balkans, all of those things, friends, would take so much money. They would need untold trillions of dollars. So what would they do? Well, they'd create a bank where they could create money out of nothing. Wouldn't that be fun to be able to do that? Michelle?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I'll take it.
Yeah.
Big girl money.
You know, there's no accounting. There's no accounting at all. You simply, hey, if I want $1 trillion, take it down to the engraving and printing office there in Washington, D.C. We'll print $1 trillion. No strings attached. Folks, this is the greatest fiasco in the history of planet Earth. That a bank could create money out of nothing, loan it to the government, and then charge interest on money created out of thin air. Now think about that. I put up a couple of $1,000s for the printing and the paper on which the printing is done. I pay a couple of $1,000. I turn around and give the money to the government, say $1 trillion, and then I start charging interest on that money. Folks, no wonder Louis T. McFadden in the 1920s and 30s cried out in the halls of Congress and said, "This is the greatest fiasco ever hoisted onto a group of people." And that's exactly what the central bank is. It is a fiasco, friends. Unbelievable. All right, Paul, and then Michelle.
Well, to give an example, well, not only did they start a bank out of nothing, they took money from other corporations to put into that bank to lend on. For every dollar they could lend 10. Didn't have to be covered. It's called a scam. But to give an example of modern day, what just happened over the last 3 years? We have this so-called pandemic. So what did they do? Oh, everybody stay home except for certain companies. Now, I've often asked, why did the little mom and pop store get closed down when you have places like Walmart open where you have hundreds of people a day coming and going? Then they said, we're going to pay you money. They printed that money out of nothing. We've been giving it to people, but then where did the money end up? Follow the whole train. Inflation kicked in. Gas went up $1, $1.50 a gallon, et cetera, et cetera. So all the money they printed, and we're going to give you money, who did they give that really to? The merchants of the earth, because every penny plus has gone into their pockets. And it's a vicious cycle, and they have to keep getting more and more and more. So there's a prime example of it. They didn't have this money to give away. They keep printing it. And inflation keeps going up, and the corporations that are left are getting it. Real quick, George Bezos, you know what he did through COVID? Do you know the yacht he built? This yacht is so massive, it has a 300-foot boat to go back and forth from land while people were losing their jobs, going to jail for work. What did he know? And he built this mega, I forget how many, it's close to $1 billion vessel during the pandemic? What did he know? Interesting.
Paul, I'll tell you, this makes me very angry. But these are the people that are in charge of the central banking in America. But Paul, it's also government officials, because they passed that into law because the Federal Reserve Bank said, if you will pass that, we'll make sure you succeed in business. That this is the most colossal cruelty. Because who pays all this money? Who pays all the interest? It's the American people. It's you and me. It'll never be paid back.
Very simple.
Yeah. Michelle, please.
No, I was only going to make a comment that I can remember before learning all this, that I just remember thinking, how can they just keep printing all that money? Like, what backs it, or, you know, what's the point, and how does it just keep an endless flow? So it's so funny, and not funny, but it's to learn all this and to see all this, and it just makes so much sense. It's crazy. Like you said, the conspiracy. The whole world, it's organized chaos conspiracy.
Absolutely, Michelle. Well, you know, you have a few people, as we've seen throughout American history. You see the Andrew Jackson. You see the congressman there in 1810 who said, no, we're not going to renew the charter. Then you come down to Lincoln. You come down to the Titanic. You come down to Lewis McFadden. And now we come to John F. Kennedy. There's only been a handful of men in American history who have said no to this insanity. But they've all paid for it. Whether it was with war or murder, they paid for it. And we're going to notice this morning, John F. Kennedy did as well. They could then receive back oodles of money of interest from the American people, thus becoming opulently wealthy from this farce and scam. The Federal Reserve Bank, it's not even owned by America. It's not an American institution. But they said, Paul Warburg and the Morgans and the Rockefellers, they said, and ultimately the papacy, they said, we're going to call it federal so people in the United States will think it's a government agency. And it's not. Has nothing to do with the United States government. The central bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, has a total government-enforced monopoly in money. Before we had the central bank, each individual bank competed with other banks. The customers, the consumers got the best deal. Not anymore. We know that today the United States government borrows money and operates under astronomical debt. Why? Common sense dictates that a policy of such enormous debt will sooner or later destroy the organization that practices it, because the interest on its debt must increase beyond its income, making payoff impossible. We've talked about this, how the bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, issues a bond to the Department of Printing and Engraving to print $1 billion worth of bills. When the bills are printed, the Federal Reserve Bank sends a check to the Department of Printing and Engraving. Federal Reserve then takes the $1 billion, lends it to the United States government, and the people of the country pay interest at an exorbitant rate each year on this money, which came out of thin air. Came out of thin air. The owners of the bank put up nothing for the money. We see that when the United States government goes into debt, $1 plus the interest goes into the pockets of the owners of the Federal Reserve Bank. This is the largest, most colossal theft ever perpetrated in the history of mankind. And it's so slick, so subtle, and so obfuscated by propaganda from the news media that the victims are not even aware of what is happening. You know, in the research I've done, another plan of the Federal Reserve Bank was to put in place professors at major universities in the United States. So if anybody opposed the central bank, these college professors would sound so intelligent, and they would support the Federal Reserve Bank. Oh, friends, it is a colossal theft that's being done. and John F. Kennedy saw it. There were three reasons why the papacy wanted their favored son. Because you remember, John F. Kennedy was the first, at least in public, Roman Catholic. He was the first one in U.S. history. So what were the reasons why they wanted to kill Kennedy in November of 1963? Kennedy attacked 3 of Rome's pets, and the third was strike 3, and it was the Federal Reserve Bank. The 3 reasons. Number 1, Kennedy vowed to destroy the CIA, the Catholic intelligence agency. This decision was reached after the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy wanted to pull America out of the senseless Vietnam War. The war would help the papacy. Folk, for a long time, the Shan Plateau in Burma was being used to grow billions and billions of dollars worth of heroin. Well, Vietnam, right next to Burma, if the papacy could gain control of Southeast Asia, complete control, they would use Vietnam to grow their heroin. Southeast Asia was also a perfect place for the growing of poppies, for the production of heroin. This was a massive money-making machine if the war could be prolonged. The third reason, Kennedy wanted to establish America on a solid monetary currency. So you mean paper money is not a solid currency? Friends, paper money is called fiat money. Paper money is worth the money, is worth the paper that it's printed on. That's the worth. The only reason a $100 bill can get us certain commodities is because we're told, and everybody agrees, that a $100 bill is a good amount of money. But friends, what if the Federal Reserve comes through and says, well, that because of inflated prices, that fiat money isn't worth anything anymore. Remember what happened in Germany during the Second World War? People would bring wheelbarrows full of money into Berlin, and that money was worthless. Why? Well, again, friends, how much value is there in a piece of paper? If I take a piece of paper, here's a piece of paper. How much value does that paper have? No value at all. It's garbage. It's trash. Throw it into the fire and let it burn. Friends, fiat money is the mechanism of the central bank to control people. The only money that has value, intrinsic value, is this right here. For the last 6,000 years, friend, people have said gold has value. Gold has value. Silver has value. Paper money? That has no value in it. It's only as people all agree that it has value. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, the amazing thing is, if you look through history, when there was commodity or something traded for something of value, the number one currency up and to and including today has been silver, because it has been steady, it's abundant, there's a limited amount of gold, and that's another beware gotcha thing. There's only so much gold, and they keep selling the same gold over and over again, and if everybody goes to cash in, well, it's kind of like the central bank. But the Lord, what was Jesus sold for, gold or silver? You know, it's interesting. That was real money. Silver
Real
has
money.
always been real money.
Absolutely.
And they do not want precious metals because it will totally destroy their fiat currency. And the term greenback, see, Abraham Lincoln understood. Are you going to go into that?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
During the Civil War, as you brought out, Lincoln was perplexed. He would not plunge the country into debt. And this country wanted to lend, and financiers came in, will lend 20, 30% interest. And he had one little advisor, I don't remember the guy's name. He said, why don't you print greenbacks? He said, what's that? Well, you make money based in the value of the country. You can't exceed that, but you can go up to that. The GDP. He did that, and they were furious with Lincoln because he ran a war with no debt.
Right.
And they were called greenbacks. That's not to be confused with Federal Reserve dollars.
Right.
Very different money. It was real paper money.
Appreciate that, Paul. From the book by Colonel James Boe-Greitz called Called to Serve, Profiles in Conspiracy, from John F. Kennedy to George Bush, he said this: when Kennedy called for a return of America's currency to the gold standard and the dismantling of the Federal Reserve System, well, what was the result? He actually minted non-debt money that does not bear the mark of the Federal Reserve. When he dared to actually exercise the leadership authority granted to him by the Constitution, Kennedy had prepared his own death warrant. It was time for him to go. John F. Kennedy, if he had gotten in for a second term, he was going to destroy the CIA, which is a Catholic intelligence agency. John F. Kennedy was going to get America out of Vietnam because he realized it was a senseless, foolish war. But when John F. Kennedy said, we're going to bring America back to the gold standard, that was it. That was it. The Constitution of the United States gives to Congress the power to coin money. Friends, the Federal Reserve Bank, by their printing money, they have gone over and beyond the Constitution. And by their printing of money, they are saying that the Constitution is a worthless document. The Constitution says that Congress is to coin money. If the United States Congress coined its own money as the Constitution directs, it would not have to pay the hundreds of billions of dollars of interest that it now pays each year to the bankers for the national debt, for money that came out of nothing. So, why is it that Congress continues to allow the Federal Reserve Bank to print fiat paper money? Why? Because the Federal Reserve is rewarding these pliant congressmen with opulent wealth, houses, homes, cars, business interests, yachts. So the congressmen are selling out their souls because they don't have to pay back the interest. Who does? You and me. Kennedy saw all that. That was why Kennedy began to issue United States government money that was free of debt to replace the Federal Reserve dollars we had been using. Now, this statement I also found, this was from a gentleman, it was from a news site called Rense, R-E-N-S-E. He said this, June 4, 1963, a virtually unknown presidential decree, Executive Order 11110, was signed with the authority to strip the Federal Reserve Bank of its power to loan money to the United States federal government at interest. With the stroke of a pen, President Kennedy declared that the privately owned Federal Reserve Bank would soon be out of business. The Christian Law Fellowship has exhaustively researched this matter through the Federal Register and Library of Congress. We can now safely conclude that this executive order has never been repealed, amended, or superseded by any subsequent executive order. It's still valid. When John Kennedy, the author of Profiles in Courage, signed this order, it returned to the federal government, specifically the Treasury Department, the constitutional power to create and issue currency without going through the privately owned Federal Reserve Bank. President Kennedy's Executive Order 11110 gave the Treasury Department the explicit authority to issue silver certificates against any silver bullion, silver or standard silver dollars in the Treasury. John F. Kennedy signed his death warrant, as Bogarde said, when he declared, we are going to give the power of creating money back into the hands of the United States departments. Five months after giving that executive order, which would have eliminated the power of the Federal Reserve Bank to create money, John F. Kennedy was killed in Dallas, Texas. Like Jackson, Lincoln, the passengers on the Titanic, Louis T. McFadden, John F. Kennedy was gunned down for daring to oppose the Federal Reserve Bank. John F. Kennedy was assassinated November 22, 1963. The United States notes he had issued were immediately taken out of circulation. Federal Reserve notes continued to serve as the legal currency of the nation. According to the United States Secret Service, 99% of all U.S. paper currency circulating in 1999 are Federal Reserve notes. These, friends, these are Federal Reserve notes. It says it right at the top. Federal Reserve note. Comes from the Federal Reserve Bank. Kennedy knew that if the silver-backed United States notes were widely circulated, they would have eliminated the demand for Federal Reserve notes. Very simple matter of economics. The United States notes were backed by silver. The Federal Reserve notes wasn't backed by anything of intrinsic value. You see the point? What gives this value, friends? It's a piece of flimsy paper that's got some ink on it. What makes that valuable? The only thing that gives this value is that we've been told that this has value and that you can use it in any store or you can pay for something with this. But of itself, friend, this has no value at all. But gold, silver, I found it fascinating when Abraham's servant Eliezer went to Haran to find a wife for his master's son Isaac. What did Eliezer take with him? He took gold. He took precious things made from gold, whether it be jewelry. Why? Because there is intrinsic value in precious metals. There's value there. Gold is valuable. Silver is valuable. Fiat money, it's worthless, friend. Five months after Kennedy was assassinated, no more of the Series 1958 silver certificates were issued either. They were subsequently removed from circulation. Perhaps the assassination of JFK was a warning to all future presidents not to interfere with the private Federal Reserve's control over the creation of money. It's very apparent that President Kennedy challenged the powers that exist behind the U.S. and world finance. With true patriotic courage, JFK boldly faced the two most successful vehicles that have ever been used to dry up debt. John F. Kennedy was the last one. That was 1963. That's 37, over 50 years now. He was the last one to speak out against the central bank. From the time of Kennedy up till now, America's debt has become so astronomical. When you talk about 30 to 35 trillion dollars, it doesn't even register in our minds. We think that's just some number out there in space. Friends, Rome has their work cut out for them. They have made this plan. It's been going on for almost 250 years in the United States. I just pray. I just pray that the Word of God, surrendering ourselves to His leading, will become the paramount decision, the paramount choice that we will make in our lives every day. Because as we make that choice, we will be able to withstand these animals